no interest or investment in anything illegitimate.
The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 were two of the greatest movies that changed cinema forever. They were some of the rarest films ever made to capture the dynamics of power, loyalty, and family in almost perfect ways. And when The Godfather Part 3 arrived in 1990, expectations soared through the ceiling from the audience. Francis Ford Coppola, after years away from the Corleones, returned to close the ultimate saga. But what we got wasn't the ending people had hoped and yearned for. It wasn't the grand masterpiece the world wanted. Yet, decades later, it stands as one of the most misunderstood chapters in movie history. So today, we're asking, what the hell happened to The Godfather Part 3? Now before we get started, hit that subscribe button for more marvelous videos, and leave a like. So let's begin. When The Godfather Part 2 swept through the theaters in 1974, Coppola swore that he was done with the franchise, because he had nothing more to say about Michael Corleone. But life has a way of bringing back old tides to the present. And by the early 80s, Coppola's dream studio, American Zoetrope, was drowning after the spectacular failure of One from the Heart, 1981. What was supposed to be his triumphant artistic statement ended up bankrupting him. His debts climbed into the tens of millions, and he found himself desperate for a way out of that mess. So when Paramount whispered the words Godfather Part 3, Coppola didn't hear opportunity, he heard rescue. And years later, he admitted that he was broke at the time. Now, the man who would define cinematic power had none. On the other hand, even Al Pacino was struggling financially. Despite his fame, his career had become slow, and the $8 million paycheck Paramount offered, plus a staggering $50,000 a day for reshoots, was a lifeline he couldn't refuse. Also, initially Coppola wanted to call the film The Death of Michael Corleone. It wasn't meant to be a sequel, but the quiet closing chapter of a tragedy. Paramount, though, wanted something that sounded more like box office gold. They rejected the title outright, and so the film became Part 3. A continuation of a story that was never supposed to continue. The trouble didn't stop there. The studio demanded the film be ready by Christmas 1990, which was an almost impossible target. Coppola and Mario Puzo asked for 6 months to write and complete the script, but Paramount gave them 6 weeks, and setting this deadline was one of the first missteps that led to the movie's downfall. They holed up in a studio suite in Reno and typed as if their lives depended on it. When the words wouldn't come, they wandered down to the casino, hoping for some inspiration. Even the production was chaotic from the first clapboard. Scenes were constantly rewritten on set. The endings were improvised almost all the time, and Coppola was still searching for the film's final moments just months before release. Even Pacino himself went to Paramount, pleading with them for a delay, but they refused because the Christmas slot meant a lot of money. The train had left the station and no one could slow it down. But even if there was a single domino that tipped everything else, it was Robert Duvall. His role of Tom Hagen has always been Michael's conscience, the cool, moral sinner that grounded his cruelty. Coppola wrote Part 3 with Hagen as a major presence, but when negotiations started, Paramount lowballed Duvall with a $1 million offer, while Pacino pocketed $8. Duvall didn't demand equality, only fairness. If they pay Pacino twice what they pay me, that's fine. But not 3 or 4 times, which is what they did. The studio refused to budge, and Duvall walked. Because of this, Coppola had to erase Hagen from the story with a throwaway line about an illness. That loss was catastrophic to the story and the movie. Without Tom, Michael had no one to speak to and no mirror to measure his decay against. George Hamilton's character, B.J. Harrison, filled the role on paper, but not in the film's soul. Coppola would later admit that losing Duvall broke the film before the cameras even started to roll. Then came the next blow. Mary Corleone, the daughter of Michael and Kay, was actually supposed to be played by Winona Ryder, who was Hollywood's rising star back then. She had the vulnerability, the charm, and the audience goodwill. After shooting Mermaids, she flew to Rome exhausted, and just one day before her first scene, she became sick. Doctors called it nervous exhaustion, warning she could suffer a breakdown if she continued. The production froze for 3 weeks, and Paramount panicked. With every day lost, millions evaporated. Julia Roberts was considered but unavailable, and Madonna was considered too old for the role. With production shut down and the costs mounting, the studio threatened to pull the plug. Coppola was concerned, fearing he might go bankrupt again. He needed someone who could start filming immediately, so he made a decision that would later haunt him. He cast his daughter, Sophia, in the role of Mary Corleone. Sophia was only 18 and not even a trained actress. She had only been standing in for Ryder during rehearsals, and what followed was one of the most brutal public takedowns in movie history. Critics called her flat, amateurish, and even movie-wrecking. Time magazine said her Gosling gracelessness nearly sank the picture. Coppola later reflected that all the bullets critics fired at her were really meant for him instead. But Roger Ebert defended her freshness, and Andy Garcia said she'd been unfairly judged. But even after all this harsh criticism, years later Sofia turned the pain into fuel, becoming an Oscar-winning filmmaker herself. If the casting controversy didn't stir enough chaos, the story was also one of the things that pushed the audience away. The romance between Vincent Mancini, Sonny's illegitimate son, and Mary Corleone shocked viewers. They were first cousins, and the film tries to paint their love as a tragic doom passion. But most of the viewers only felt the discomfort. The already clumsy dialogue made things even worse. While Coppola's intention was cultural authenticity, with cousin marriage being permitted in Sicilian families, it didn't land well with the audience in 90s America. What did work, however, was the film's political heart. Coppola and Puzo rooted for the story in real-world Vatican banking scandals that rocked Italy in the late 70s and early 80s. The film's Vatican bank subplot, Michael's $600 million deal to buy legitimacy, was inspired by the actual collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, whose chairman, Roberto Calvi, was found hanging under London's Blackfriars Bridge in 1982. Official suicide, but almost certainly murder. Part 3 used those events as a mirror for Michael's actions in the film. The church, which was meant to cleanse his soul, was as corrupt as the world he wanted to leave behind. Even the death of Pope John Paul I, who ruled for only 33 days, was dramatized in the film as another power play. Coppola turned his story into a parable, the Vatican as another mafia cloaked in holiness, and this was a masterstroke. Behind the camera, Part 3 might have looked entirely different. Before Andy Garcia landed the role of Vincent, Coppola considered some of the big names in Hollywood, like Alec Baldwin, Tom Cruise, Val Kilmer, and his nephew, Nicolas Cage. But Garcia won the part with raw charisma and an edge that recalled a younger Pacino. He even earned an Oscar nomination for his exceptional performance. Other what-ifs, like Winona Ryder and Robert Duvall, didn't work out, and before Coppola returned, the studio considered names like Martin Scorsese and Michael Cimino to direct the film. Imagine The Godfather Part 3 by Scorsese. But that alternate universe never came into existence either, and Coppola took the reins once again because, in his words, no one else should bury Michael Corleone. Even though Part 3 stumbles, it still falls beautifully. The final act is a haunting opera within an opera. As Michael's son Anthony performs in Cavalleria Rusticana at the Teatro Massimo, assassinations unfold backstage. There's a bloody symphony echoing the baptism murders of the first film. Coppola's camera lingers on oranges, his recurring symbol of death, as the music swells. Vincent bites an enemy's ear, which was a brutal echo of Sonny's temper, and then comes the moment where Mary Corleone is shot, collapsing on the opera steps. Michael opens his mouth to scream, but no sound escapes. It's a pure tragedy of a father punished cruelly by fate. In the theatrical cut, we see an aged Michael die alone in Sicily. But in Coppola's 2020 recut, The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, his death is removed from the film. The film ends on that silent scream and a title card. When a Sicilian wishes you cent'anni, it means for long life, and a Sicilian never forgets. Coppola said it best that Michael didn't deserve death's peace, only the endless ache of memory. One of the film's triumphs is Michael's confession. In a courtyard bathed in golden light, he kneels before Cardinal Lamberto and unravels decades of sin. I killed men, he admits. I killed my brother. I killed my father's son. Pacino's voice trembles, and it's one of the best performances he's ever delivered. The Cardinal doesn't offer comfort, but only the truth. Your sins are terrible. It is just that you suffer. And it is a line that summarizes the essence of the trilogy. Redemption isn't granted for anyone. Instead, it's always paid for in grief. And for a brief moment, we see Michael as a man stripped of his empire, left only with his guilt. It's as close as he ever comes to salvation. Scenes like these are what drove the movie despite its hurdles. And every Godfather film needs a villain. For Part 3, the role was filled by Joey Zaza, played with flamboyant menace by Joe Mantegna. Zaza was a creature of the modern world. Flashy suits, public bravado, and TV cameras. He was precisely the kind of gangster that Michael despised. But Zaza's reign of terror gave us the film's most talked about scene, the helicopter massacre. As the mob's commission meets in an Atlantic City skyscraper, a chopper swoops down, riddling the room with bullets. Bodies fall while chaos reigns. It's audacious, maybe too much so. Critics called it cartoonish, missing the quiet dread that made the earlier films terrifying. Still, in its excess, it captured something true about organized crime in the age of media. Zaza himself meets a poetic death during a street parade. Amid confetti and trumpets, Vincent corners him and ends it violently. It's operatic, it's messy, and it feels like the world has outgrown Michael's kind of order. And that mirrors the progress of the world we live in. When Part 3 finally hit the theaters in December 1990, the numbers weren't terrible. $136 million worldwide on a $54 million budget. But compared to the giants it followed, it felt small. The reviews were divided, with some calling it a noble failure, while others called it a tragedy of compromise. It even earned 7 Academy Award nominations, including 2 for Best Picture and Director, yet won none. when the conversation wasn't about Pacino's haunted performance or Coppola's direction, it was about Sofia's casting and the sense that the film had lost its soul. Over time, though, that judgment softened. Critics began to see the movie not as a failure, but as an inevitable consequence of impossible expectations. After all, how could any film follow The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 and win? So 3 decades later, Coppola revisited his greatest franchise. In 2020, he released a new cut of Part 3 as The Godfather Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone. It was not just a re-edit of the film, it was a reinvention of it. The new version opens differently, trims scenes, restores the pacing, and ends not with Michael's death, but with his endless grief. The changes are very subtle, but really powerful. By moving the Vatican scene to the start, Coppola gave the film a sense of clarity. By tightening its structure, he restored its dignity, and by removing Michael's death, he gave him the ultimate punishment. Diane Keaton and Al Pacino both praised it as the version that should have been released. It didn't turn Part 3 into a masterpiece, but it revealed the masterpiece hidden inside it to the audience. Years after its release, The Godfather Part 3 has transformed into something more complicated and necessary. Every great saga eventually reaches its imperfect chapter, and for The Godfather, this was one. The film served as both a mirror and a eulogy for Michael Corleone and the lovers of the franchise. The movie's flaws preserve the perfection of the first two. Its messy nature made the earlier films shine even brighter in contrast. And without Part 3, there would be no sense of finality, no reckoning for Michael, and no haunting silence after the storm. In many ways, Coppola used this film not to glorify the Corleones, but to bury them, showing that everything has its price. Over time, the movie found people who would defend its honor, critics, fans, and even Coppola himself, with his 2020 re-edited version. This version tightened the narrative, restored its intended title, and restored its true soul. Watching it today, you realize that the film was never meant to compete with its predecessors. Instead, it was meant for closing the book. And that's its true legacy. The Godfather Part 3 might not have been the film audiences wanted, but it's the one the story needed. And in that final moment, as Michael sits alone in silence, the saga ends not with violence, but with the quiet tragedy of a man finally left with nothing but the weight of his sins. And looking back now, The Godfather Part 3 was doomed by the impossible expectations. No sequel could ever match the first two films. Not because Coppola failed, but because the story had already been completed. What he gave us in the third part wasn't another crime epic, but a confession of regret, aging, and the futility of power. Yes, it stumbled. Yes, some of the choices didn't work. But Coppola once said, you can't make a perfect film, but you can make an honest one. And that's precisely what Part 3 is. Flawed, human, and painfully honest. Finally, it may never stand shoulder to shoulder with its predecessors, but it doesn't have to, because it gives a beautiful end to a franchise that is truly marvelous. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.